the next part of human geography I'd like to talk about for Middle America, and also this will be relevant to South America as well, and we'll talk more about it, but is the colonial period. And specifically, this starts with the Spanish conquest in the 1500s. And the Spanish end up taking over most of Middle America, including Mexico, most of Central America, with some exceptions. The British were there later on and took over parts of what's now Belize, the island of Jamaica. And the Spanish controlled also much of the Caribbean as well, although there were exceptions there too, such as Haiti, which was a French colony, and Jamaica again, which was a British colony. And the Lesser Antilles, the small islands, had a real mix of different colonial control over time. Here's the view of the colonial situation in the late 1700s. Here, the United States is newly independent, but this area in red behind the United States, extending all the way down through South America, was a part of the Spanish Empire. So the Spanish were the largest empire, the most dominant ones in Middle America, although they weren't the only one. So here in blue, you can see Haiti, which was a French colony, and Jamaica, which was a British colony, and then various others in the Caribbean. The most devastating result of the Spanish colonial period was the introduction of diseases which ended up killing upward of 90 to 95% of the indigenous people. This varied by location, but many of the estimates are above 90% of the people in the Americas died as a direct result of the contact with Europeans. So you had high indigenous death rates. You also had a transformation of the environment because of the changes in agriculture that occurred, a lot of exploitative agriculture that took out trees over much of the environment and changed it dramatically. Now, the colonial period lasted up until about the 1800s. So there was a large, without getting into too much detail, many Middle American countries gained independence in the 1800s. This is also around the time of the Monroe Doctrine, where the US has a policy to try to keep countries from being recolonized by European powers. It was a way to exert control by the United States, but it had the side effect of avoiding recolonization of much of Middle America. This is an image showing what's called the Columbian Exchange. That during the colonial period, you had an exchange of different foods from the Americas to Europe and Africa, and likewise from Africa and Europe to the Americas. So things like tomato, corn, avocados came from the Americas, where the introduction of things like bananas, grapes, and sugarcane came from Europe or Africa into the Americas. Probably the most notable was introduction of diseases as well. So this is a figure from Wikipedia showing the colonial situation in 1700. Here again, you have France in control of Haiti, the Spanish control of much of everything else, with the exception that the British controlled a lot of the edges of Central America, Jamaica, and parts of the Caribbean. By the 1800s, when you have the independence movement, we start to see independent countries such as Mexico and Colombia. We don't yet see the countries of Central America. They tend to emerge later. Now, Spain does still have a few things such as Cuba and Puerto Rico. And another change that occurred specifically in regards to the United States was the Spanish-American War in the late 1800s. And this ended up with the United States taking possession of Cuba for a short period of time and Puerto Rico, which is still a U.S. territory now. Just after that period, you also had the U.S. sort of bought control in what's called the Panama Canal Zone, and that lasted until the late 1900s. And besides direct control, you also had heavy influence of the United States in terms of corporations. That a lot of companies in the United States established plantations all throughout Central America during the 1900s. And to this day, many islands, especially in the Lesser Antilles, are not independent countries. They're not called colonies any longer, but they have a special term called non-self-governing territories. And if we look at a map of where non-self-governing territories exist, many of them that are the ones that are labeled on the map are Lesser Antilles Islands in the Caribbean. So in 1898, you had the United States takes over Cuba, then keeps a naval base and then gives it back, and also Puerto Rico. And we have the emergence of the Central American countries for the most part. Later on, Cuba's independent, but the United States retains Puerto Rico. You had the establishment of Panama, and the U.S. controls the canal zone. And by the 1980s, you had mostly independence throughout the region, again, with the exception of some of the Lesser Antilles and Puerto Rico. One thing to note about agriculture in the Americas, and this is related to the colonial period because different colonizing powers practice different types of agriculture. After this, I'm going to show a case study from Vox that describes the different agriculture in Haiti versus the Dominican Republic. So for some context, a couple of terms here. One is called the hacienda system. And this is primarily a Spanish system of land use. And in the hacienda system, you have a mix of both commercial activity and subsistence agriculture. So it is considered a lighter footprint on the land. The land isn't as overworked as in plantation agriculture, which we'll talk about. One thing that's related to the hacienda system is something called ejidos, that during some land reforms in Mexico, you had communal farms that operated under sort of the same principle as a hacienda. Now, by contrast to the hacienda, you also had plantations. These were primarily in the Caribbean, along the coast and islands, and these were operated for efficiency and profit. And instead of these were not subsistence agriculture, this is primarily export crops such as sugars, bananas, and coffee. Again, we talked about altitudinal zonation. The hot coastal plains are often where you have these types of plantations. Originally, like plantations in the United States, these were operated with slave labor, and they continue to operate not with slaves, but with people who make meager wages. So again, just to highlight, this is the Dominican Republic here, and Haiti here, both sharing the island of Hispaniola, but both with very different colonial histories, and with both different types of agriculture. One, more of the haciendas type system in the Dominican Republic, and more plantation type agriculture in Haiti. And this has resulted in a really dramatic difference in their physical environments. With Haiti on the left here, you can see which has really been devastated and lost a lot of its tree cover because people have over-harvested resources, whereas the Dominican Republic still has a different environment because it hasn't been worked as hard historically during the colonial period. More on that in the next video from Vox.